The coldest room in Grayfield Elementary School wasn't the boiler basement or the walk-in freezer in the cafeteria kitchen. It was the teacher's lounge on the third floor, and the chill had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Neva Strand had been working there for 11 days when she figured that out. She'd arrived at the start of September with a cardboard box, a laminated substitute teaching certificate, and a quiet so complete that the other staff members filled it with their own conclusions. Too young, too plain, probably wouldn't last the semester. She kept her head down, said yes ma'am and yes sir, and showed up early to arrange the crayon bins before the kids came in. Nobody noticed. That was fine. Neva had spent 6 years being invisible in places a lot more dangerous than a third-grade classroom in Grayfield, Kansas. The school's vice principal was a man named Holt Brennan. Tall, button-collar shirts, the kind of voice that had never once questioned itself. He'd interviewed Neva for the long-term sub position because the regular third-grade teacher, Mrs. Aldano, had gone on maternity leave 3 weeks early. Brennan hadn't wanted Neva. He'd said so to the administrative coordinator, Della, not quietly enough, while Neva was still in the hallway finishing her paperwork. She doesn't have a classroom management background, he'd said. She looks like she's barely out of college. These kids will eat her alive. Neva had heard every word. She'd pressed her pen a little harder into the signature line and said nothing. The first week, Brennan had stopped by room 14 3 times. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and his eyes moving like he was cataloging failures. The kids were fine. They were more than fine. Neva had a way of explaining things that made even long division feel like a secret being shared, and the class had started looking forward to math, which Della told her in hushed, awed tones had never happened before. But Brennan didn't mention that. He mentioned that her desk was cluttered, that she hadn't posted the week's learning objectives in the correct font size on the whiteboard, and that she was using indoor recess time for silent reading instead of structured play. "I'll make the corrections," Neva said each time. "See that you do," he said each time back, and walked away before she could respond. The other teachers watched and said nothing. Most of them were kind in the break room, offering her coffee and the occasional sympathetic look, but no one contradicted Brennan out loud. He'd been vice principal for 9 years. His moods were weather. You dressed for them and stayed out of the worst of it. There was one exception. A 4th-grade teacher named Polly Oakes, who had silver-streaked hair and a habit of bringing homemade biscotti on Fridays, found Neva alone in the copy room on her 3rd day and said, "Don't let him get in your head. You're doing fine." She'd said it fast, like she was slipping contraband into Neva's hand, and then walked out before Neva could thank her. Neva had thought about that for a long time afterward. She'd been thanked before in other ways, in other rooms. But Polly's version had a particular weight. She'd tuck it away with the other things she kept quiet. By the 2nd week, Brennan had moved from inspection to interference. He reassigned Neva's planning period without notice so she could cover lunch supervision. He left notes in her mailbox, printed, not handwritten, pointing out discrepancies between her submitted lesson plans and what he'd observed in the classroom. Once, he'd waited until the kids were at gym class to come in and rearrange her reading corner without telling her, moving the beanbag chairs to the back wall and replacing her carefully curated book display with a rack of leveled readers sorted by Lexile score. When Neva came back and found it, she stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she moved the beanbag chairs back. Not all the way. She kept the leveled readers, because he wasn't wrong that some of her students needed the structure. But she put the display books back where the kids could reach them. She pushed the furniture back into the half circle that let the shy kids sit on the edge without feeling exposed. She adjusted the lamp she'd brought from home, so it threw a warm pool of light in the corner where a boy named Bio liked to read during choice time, because Bio struggled with the overhead fluorescence, and nobody had thought to ask him why he always squinted. She didn't file a complaint. She didn't say a word to Brennan. She just reset the room and went back to teaching. There was a word for this, she knew. In her old life, they'd called it tactical patience. You didn't spend ammunition on targets that weren't worth the cost. You waited. You maintained position. You kept your eyes on what actually mattered. What mattered was the kids, It was a Tuesday in late October when everything changed. The morning had started the way Tuesday mornings usually did. Bayo's mom dropping him off late because of the Tuesday farmers market traffic, a spelling quiz that went better than expected, and a fire drill that cut into the middle of Neva's read aloud of Charlotte's Web at the worst possible chapter. Neva had shepherded her 22 third graders down the east stairwell and out to the designated assembly zone on the far soccer field, counted heads, and stood in the thin autumn sunshine, waiting for the all-clear. Brennan had walked the line of teachers, with his clipboard, making notes. When he got to Neva, he'd looked at his watch meaningfully. "Your class was the second to last one out," he said. "We were in the middle of a read aloud," Neva said. "I had to mark the page so we didn't lose our place. It cost me about 8 seconds. Brennan looked at her. "The protocol doesn't make allowances for reading breaks, Miss Strand." "I understand. Next time I'll leave the book open." He'd written something on his clipboard. She'd watched the pen move and kept her face neutral. The all clear came. They walked back inside. Neva finished the chapter. Wilbur's first conversation with Charlotte, and 22 third graders sat in absolute silence, which was a kind of miracle. By the time the lunch bell rang, she'd almost forgotten about Brennan's clipboard. She was collecting the lunch count slips at her desk when Polly Oakes appeared in the doorway, face different than usual. Tighter. "Something's happening," Polly said. "The main office just went to lockdown protocol." Burgess texted me. Neva was already on her feet. In schools, lockdown protocols meant one of a few things: gas leak, weather emergency, or a person. Her brain sorted through the options in the time it took her to cross the room. Gas leak would have come with an announcement. Weather was clear today. The timing, late morning, right before the lunch rotation when traffic in the hallways was highest. Was deliberate if it was the third option. She closed her classroom door and turned the interior lock. She went to the window and checked the exterior. 2 police cruisers were pulling into the east parking lot, which meant the call had gone out at least 3 minutes ago, which meant whatever was happening had already been in motion for longer than that. "Get everyone to the back corner," she told Polly, who had come in with 6 of her own 4th graders who had been in the hall when the alert hit. "Away from the door and the windows. Sit on the floor, Neva, please." Her voice was quiet, not frightened. The kind of quiet that made people move. Polly moved. The kids moved. 28 children arranged themselves in the far corner of room 14, with the particular gravity of children who understand that something is happening and that the adults are handling it. Neva pulled the door's small window shade. She turned off the lights. She moved the desk, quietly, steadily, the way you move something when you don't want to make noise but also genuinely need it in a different place, to block the lower half of the door. Then she knelt with the kids and waited. The first 3 minutes were quiet. The kids were holding hands in a chain, Bayo in the middle, because the dark bothered him less than it bothered some of the others. Polly was at the end of the chain, eyes on Neva. Neva was watching the door. Then she heard it. Not sirens. Not the PA system. Footsteps in the hallway. One set, moving without the specific cadence of law enforcement. No radio crackle. No call and response. Someone moving alone, testing doors. The handle of room 14 turned. The desk shifted half an inch against the door. The handle turned again, harder this time. Neva's hand found Polly's arm in the dark. One squeeze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In her mind, she was already running through what she had. The room was a rectangle, 18 feet by 22. One door, one point of entry. The windows were on the second floor. Viable exit for adults if cleared. Not viable for 28 kids in under 60 seconds. The desk was particle board, not a real barrier. The supply closet at the back of the room had a solid door and a hook latch, built in 1987, which meant it would hold a determined push for about 4 seconds. What she didn't have: radio, weapon, backup. What she did have: time, positioning, and 11 days of watching how this building moved. The footsteps stopped outside the door. There was a pause. 3 seconds. 4. And then the sound of something hard making contact with the doorframe. Testing. Not trying to break through. Trying to determine resistance. Neva stood up slowly. She moved to the supply closet and opened it as silently as she could. She beckoned Polly with 2 fingers. a gesture so practiced it was almost muscle memory, and mouthed, "Kids, inside." Now, Polly understood. She began moving children into the closet in absolute silence, one by one, her hand on each small shoulder. Neva stood beside the door. She had a stapler, a set of scissors from the art caddy, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside the board, 8 pounds, pressurized, the pin intact. She ran the calculation once, very quickly, the way she'd been trained to do, in places where running calculations was the difference between coming home and not. The extinguisher would do. She took it off the wall. What happened next took 4 minutes by the clock on Neva's classroom wall, though it felt both much shorter and much longer, depending on which part of it you were living through. The door came open. Brennan's desk barrier held it to about 8 inches before the particle board gave. The man who came through was not a parent in distress. He was not a student. He was large, moving carefully, wearing a jacket that was too heavy for the weather. His eyes went to the empty room and stayed there for exactly 1 second. The 1 second that Neva needed. She hit him with the extinguisher once, hard, the way you hit something when you've spent 6 years learning that hesitation is a kind of violence against yourself. He went down sideways into the bookshelf. She was already moving, extinguisher up, one knee on his back, applying pressure to the points that would keep him still. He struggled. He was bigger than her by at least 80 pounds. It didn't matter. She'd trained with men twice her size in conditions that would make a Kansas October feel like a spa weekend. She had his arm immobilized in under 30 seconds. She was reaching for her phone to call 911 when the door opened again, and Officer Tanya Kress from the Grayfield PD came through it with her weapon drawn, her eyes wide, and already reading the scene. Classroom. 2 adults on the floor, woman kneeling on a man's back with a fire extinguisher in her left hand. 0 children visible. Kids are in the supply closet, Neva said. He's down. Right shoulder's going to need x-rays. Tanya holstered her weapon slowly. She was looking at Neva the way people looked at things they hadn't expected and weren't sure how to categorize. Are you hurt? No. Is he? Restrained. Conscious. Shoulders dislocated, possibly fractured. He'll need transport. Tanya called it in. Her voice was steady, but she kept glancing at Neva the entire time she was talking. More officers came. Then a detective. Then the principal, Janine Burgess, who had the look of someone who'd sprinted across a parking lot and hadn't entirely caught her breath yet. The children came out of the supply closet one by one, blinking in the light, and were escorted to the gym where parents were being called. Polly came out last, holding Bayo's hand, and when she saw Neva, she made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Brennan arrived at some point. Neva was giving her statement to the detective, calmly, in precise chronological order, with the kind of detail that made the detective's pen slow down and then speed up, when she heard Brennan's voice from the doorway. "What is going on in here? Someone needs to explain to me what." He stopped. He was looking at the overturned furniture, the extinguisher on the floor, the officers. His eyes landed on Neva. "Mrs. Strand, what did you do?" The detective looked at Brennan, then back at Neva. "This is your vice principal?" "Yes," Neva said. "And you are?" The detective checked his notepad. "A long-term substitute teacher." "Yes." The detective wrote something down. His expression was professionally neutral, but his eyebrows had been doing something complex for the last several minutes. Brennan stepped further into the room. "Someone needs to explain the protocol failure here. The students were supposed to be evacuated. The students were in the supply closet," Officer Tanya Kress said, from the corner. "All 28 of them. Safe and accounted for." "The protocol, Mr. Brennan," Neva said. Her voice was the same one she used in the classroom. Not raised, not sharpened. The one that made 22 third graders go quiet mid-sentence. Brennan stopped. "The protocol says shelter in place and wait for law enforcement," Neva said. "I sheltered the children. Law enforcement arrived. The situation is resolved." She paused. "Is there something else?" Brennan looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes. Recalculation, maybe. Or the beginning of a question he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. He didn't say anything else. He stepped back out of the doorway. The man in the too heavy jacket turned out to be a disgruntled former employee of the school district, who'd been terminated 6 months earlier for reasons that were now being reviewed by the county sheriff. He wasn't armed with anything more than the intent to frighten, which made the situation less catastrophic in hindsight than it had felt in room 14. But nobody at Grayfield Elementary felt particularly comforted by the qualifier. The stories circulated the way stories do in small schools, fast and wrong in the details, but right in the outline. By the end of the day, the version that had taken hold went something like: the new sub took down a man twice her size with a fire extinguisher and then calmly gave a police report while still in the classroom, which was accurate, more or less. Parents called. The local paper sent someone who stood on the sidewalk until Principal Burgess came out and spoke to them. Neva declined to be interviewed. She stayed in room 14 until the last officer left, then swept up the broken pieces of a mug that had fallen off the bookshelf in the scuffle, replaced the extinguisher on its bracket, and moved the desk back to its original position. She was grading the Tuesday spelling quizzes when Polly Oakes came back. Polly stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the room. Orderly again, the reading corner with its beanbag chairs and warm lamp, the student artwork along the top of the whiteboard, Bio's drawing of a robot dog that had been on the wall since week 1. "How are you doing this right now?" Polly asked. "The quizzes were due today," Neva said. "The kids did well. I wanted to tell them tomorrow." Polly came in and sat in one of the student chairs, too small for her, knees up at an angle, and looked at Neva for a long time. "Who are you?" she finally said. It wasn't accusing. It was genuine. The question of someone who'd believed one thing and was now holding a different set of facts and wasn't sure how they fit together. Neva set down her red pen. She thought about how to answer that. "I'm a third-grade sub," she said. "I used to do something else." "Something else," Polly repeated, for a while. Polly waited, the way she waited when a student was working something out, and she didn't want to interrupt the process. "Combat search and rescue," Neva said finally. "Air Force. 4 deployments I got out 2 years ago." She picked up the red pen again. "I like it here. The kids are good." Polly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bayo's going to talk about this for the rest of his life." "He was very brave," Neva said. "They all were. You were also very brave." Neva made a small sound that might have been disagreement. "I was trained. It's different." 3 days passed. The school settled back into its routines with the particular resilience of children, who are often better at returning to normal than the adults around them. The spelling results went up on the Friday word wall. Bio finished his chapter book ahead of schedule. 2 of Neva's students started a trend of calling the supply closet the secret base, which she privately found charming and publicly discouraged as a distraction. Brennan had been quieter since Tuesday. He still walked the halls. He still had his clipboard. But he hadn't stopped by room 14, and the note in Neva's mailbox that Friday was from Principal Burgess. Not him, thanking her for her quick thinking and inviting her to the staff appreciation luncheon in November. She wasn't sure what to make of the quiet. She'd learned over years not to mistake a lull for a resolution. She found out on Friday afternoon during the 20 minutes between the last bell and bus duty. She was at her desk going over the following week's math progression when she heard the sound from the main hallway, a specific kind of sound that she hadn't heard in 2 years and had not expected to hear in a school in Grayfield, Kansas. Boots, moving in formation, not running. The deliberate, even pace of people who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. She was standing at her door before she'd consciously decided to move. The main hallway of Grayfield Elementary was a broad corridor with trophy cases and student art along both walls and a linoleum floor that was waxed on the first Tuesday of every month. At the far end of it, 6 people were walking toward her in a loose but unmistakable formation, flight suits, no cover in deference to the building, military bearing that no amount of civilian clothes could have disguised. At the front was a woman with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone who'd been in charge of things for a long time. Lieutenant Colonel Renata Fujikawa, 58th Rescue Squadron, Nellis Air Force Base. Neva had last seen her in a hangar in Qatar 2 years ago, shaking her hand over a set of separation paperwork. Behind her were 5 people Neva had trusted her life to. Pryor, Okafor, Mack, Singh, Beckenridge, the whole team, together. Neva stood in the hallway and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years, the specific sensation of being known, completely and without caveat, by the people who knew what she was actually capable of. "Strand," said Lieutenant Colonel Fujikawa, not a greeting, a statement. "Colonel Fujikawa." Neva's voice was steady. She was very aware of Polly Oak standing 6 feet behind her, and the faces of several staff members appearing in classroom doorways, and the fact that Brennan had come out of his office at the end of the hall and was standing very still with his clipboard at his side. "We heard about Tuesday," Fujikawa said. She stopped about 4 feet away and looked at Neva the way she always had, not searching for anything, because she already knew what was there, confirming it. School paper ran it online. Pryor saw it. Pryor raised a hand. He was grinning. "I'm fine," Neva said. "The situation was resolved," Fujikawa said. "Yeah, we gathered." She paused. "We also gathered that you've been teaching 3rd grade for 11 days and not telling anyone why the kids have gotten eerily good at math. Consistent reinforcement," Neva said. "Low-stakes repetition. It works." "Of course it does." Fujikawa looked at the hallway, the trophy cases, the student art, the waxed floor, and something moved briefly across her face that might have been warmth. "We're here because Pryor felt, and I agreed, that you deserved to hear it in person." "Hear what?" Fujikawa reached into the front of her flight suit and took out a folded piece of paper. She held it out, and Neva unfolded it. A formal letter, signed and dated, from the Department of the Air Force, awarding Neva Strand a commendation for the recovery operation she'd led on her last deployment. An operation that had never been publicly classified as what it was, because most of what they did never was. She'd been out of the service before the paperwork cleared. The letter had bounced around 3 forwarding addresses before Renata Fujikawa had gone looking for it, personally. Neva looked at the letter for a long time. "You didn't have to come in person," she said. "No," Fujikawa agreed. "We wanted to." She stepped forward, and the two of them shook hands the way they had in the hangar in Qatar, firm, equal, long. Then Pryor stepped forward and shook Neva's hand too, and then Okafor and Mac and Singh and Beckenridge. One by one, the people who had flown into things she couldn't describe in a school hallway in Kansas shook the hand of the woman who had gotten them home. Polly Oakes, behind Neva, pressed one hand over her mouth. She was not the only one. Neva heard footsteps, soft, hesitant, and looked sideways. Brennan was standing at the edge of the hallway, clipboard down at his side now, no longer writing anything. He was watching the 6 people from Nellis Air Force Base shake hands with the substitute teacher he'd assigned lunch supervision to without notice, and something in his face had reorganized itself entirely. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Fujikawa glanced at him with the calm attention of someone who made assessments for a living, then looked back at Neva. "Good people here?" she said, quietly enough that it was just between them. Neva considered the question. She thought about Polly bringing biscotti, about Bio's robot dog drawing on the wall, about 22 third graders sitting in silence, holding hands, trusting her. "Good kids," she said. "I'm still figuring out the adults." Fujikawa's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something better. The expression of someone who'd watched a person figure out where they belonged and recognize the moment. "Well," she said, "you always did take the harder assignment." The team stayed for 40 minutes. Pryor ended up in room 14 looking at the student artwork and made a comment about Bio's robot dog that Neva made a note to pass along. Singh asked about the spelling quiz scores, because Singh had always been particular about data. And Neva pulled up the class averages on her laptop, and they talked for a few minutes with the ease of people who speak the same technical language and don't need to translate. When they left, the hallway was quieter than it had been all day. Neva walked Fujikawa to the main entrance, and at the door the colonel stopped and turned. "You doing okay?" she asked, not the polite version. "Yeah," Neva said. "I think I am." Fujikawa nodded once. "Good school? Getting there? Good kids? Genuinely good kids? Then you're where you need to be." Fujikawa zipped her flight suit a 1/4 inch. "The letter's yours. You earned it. The rest of it." She gestured, slightly, at the school around them. "You're earning that too." She walked out into the October afternoon, and the other five followed, and Neva stood in the front doorway and watched them cross the parking lot to the two rental cars they'd come in from Wichita. She was still standing there when Brennan came up beside her. He stood at the edge of the doorway, looking out. He didn't say anything for a moment. Neva didn't help him. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. The words came out with the effort of something that had been turned over several times before it was said. "I made assumptions about your experience level, about what you were capable of." He paused. "I was wrong." Neva looked out at the parking lot, where the rental cars were pulling out onto the street. "I know," she said. She let that sit for a moment. "I appreciate you saying it." Brennan was quiet. Then, the desk thing. "I moved your furniture without telling you." "You did! I shouldn't have." "No," Neva agreed. "You shouldn't have." Another pause. Brennan cleared his throat. "The kids, Bayao's mother called this afternoon. She wanted to thank you." He hesitated. "Several parents did, actually. I should have passed the messages along directly, instead of putting them in the weekly summary. That would have been better." "Yes." He nodded. It was a small nod, compact, with the effort of a man who was used to being right and was currently somewhere unfamiliar. "I'll do that going forward," he said. "Good," Neva said. She turned from the doorway and walked back down the hall toward room 14. She had the last of the spelling quizzes to finish and a math progression for Monday to finalize, and Bayo's mother's phone number to add to her contact list so she could call her directly and tell her that her son had been, in the particular language of third-grade courage, extraordinary. Behind her, the school was settling into the last quiet of Friday afternoon. The particular quality of silence that schools have at the end of the week, when the children are gone and the week's work is done, and the rooms hold the echo of everything that happened in them. Neva Strand sat down at her desk, picked up her red pen, and got back to work. The commendation letter was folded neatly in the top drawer. The supply closet door was closed. On the wall beside the window, in a blue crayon, a robot dog watched over everything.